Without further ado, let's do this. Good afternoon, everyone. I will call to order the October 15th meeting of the Special Committee on Climate Change. I will welcome committee members. 20 seconds, so that date is incorrect on the wall. That's what you're telling me. Good to know. Appreciate that one, gentlemen. Welcome, Minister. Today we have with us Steve Howard, Sydney McEwen, Hal Perry, Ole Hammerland, Sunny Gallant, and Minister Trivers. Welcome back to the Special Committee on Climate Change. It's been a while since we've had you here. I'm glad you could join us. So before I get started, can I get a movement to adopt the agenda? Moved by Sunny Gallant. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I will give the floor over to our presenters. We are hearing from the California Healthy Soils Program through the Department of Food and Agriculture in California. So welcome today. Thank you for taking the time to speak with our committee. If you could please introduce yourself for the record when you begin, that would be fantastic, and we'll hold our questions until the end. Thank you.
Hi, good morning. Thank you everybody for having me. My name is Rachel O'Brien. I am the Deputy Secretary of Legislative Affairs for the Department of Food and Agriculture, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today. On behalf of the state of California, I'd like to express our enthusiasm for partnerships like this where we can share best practices and tools to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. California's latest greenhouse gas data shows that while the state continues to stay below its 2020 target for emissions, there is much more work to do to achieve the 2030 targets we have set and our carbon neutrality goals. In recognition of the role natural and working lands can play in helping the state achieve these goals, the California Department of Food and Agriculture works with hundreds of farming and ranching families to implement climate-smart agricultural practices that support their land stewardship and promote sustainability and resiliency. Our suite of climate-smart agricultural programs is administered by our Office of Environmental Farming and Innovation, or as we sometimes refer to as OFI, supporting agricultural production and incentivizing practices that result in a net benefit for the environment through science, innovation, and efficient management. Our climate-smart agricultural umbrella includes dairy and livestock methane reduction programs, a water and electricity saving program, technical assistance providers, and our Healthy Soils program. Soil health is defined as the capacity of soil to function as a living system, and healthy soil contributes to mitigating climate change by maintaining or increasing content. Our state's Healthy Soil program was created as a result of the California Healthy Soils Initiative. This was a collaboration of state agencies and departments to promote the development of healthy soils on California's farmlands and ranch lands. CDFA's Healthy Soils program is funded through the state's cap and trade program proceeds, the auction proceeds. These are also known as the California Climate Investments, or CCI. The program received $40.5 million in funding from the CCI between 2016 and 2019. And CDFA has also received funding of $10 million from the Climate, Drought, Water, Parks, Coastal Protection, and Outdoor Access for All Act of 2018. This was a bond initiative. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Amrith Gunasekara. He's our science advisor to the secretary and manager of our OFI, our Office of Environmental Farming and Innovation program. Thank you.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Chairland, Honorable Minister Trivers, and Assembly members of the Special Committee. Thank you very much for this invitation to be here. I had the pleasure of visiting Prince Edward Islands in 1996 with my parents and drove through the Bay of Fundy and got to see Anne of Green Gables and everything that the island has to offer. So a small world, and now giving a presentation to your committee. So thank you again for the invitation. I hope you can see my slideshow. I'm trying to see if I can just get it on one screen. But I don't think I can, so. Okay, we'll just go with this. So My name is Amrit Gunasekara, and I work for the Office of Environmental Farming and Innovation, CDFA. Um, the office is really involved with doing several things. We have some incentive programs. One of those is the Healthy Soils program. We have demonstration projects, which further try to do these practices and then share that information with growers further and get the word out on the practices and how they help the soil and the environment and further the environmental footprint of ag operations in the state. We do some information sharing such as this. So thank you again for the invitation. And we do get involved with some research. I have put a link here. We are very science-based program that supports the executive office and the department and the secretary. So as I mentioned, we have several incentive programs. One I will be talking about today is the Healthy Soils program. And we're very glad to be here to share information on that. I put a little orange mark on where you are and where we are. We're a very, very big landmass with the 5th largest economy in the world. So a lot happens in this state. We are next to an ocean, so we have many ports that we also use to distribute our ag commodities throughout the world. We're known for our surfing and Disneyland and Hollywood and Golden Gate Bridge and Yosemite, but we are also known for what we call specialty crops. And specialty crops are all those crops that are not grown in the Midwest. So they're the fruits and vegetables we enjoy in our salads and fruit salads. And we're the leading producer of specialty crops in the nation. We have 400 plus commodities, a lot of innovation and technology, a lot of automation going on now with labor issues and just innovative ways to grow food here, including efficient drip irrigation. We have about 69,400 farms, and we are fortunate to have the leading ag universities in this state. For example, the University of California in Davis is just half an hour away from the capital, Sacramento, where we reside. So very fortunate to have those resources here. This is a quick look from the CDFA NAS the USDA NAS ag statistics. We collect this information from the ag commissioners in the county, which then get turned into USDA for evaluation. So these are the crops and livestock commodities in which California leads the nation. The ones in bold is where we produce 99% or more of that commodity. So you can see almonds, grapes, raisins. Of course, we're known for our wine, but there's also raisin production, peaches, olives, pistachios. So a lot of specialty crops grown in this state, and therefore very diverse crop production. Here's some additional statistics from our webpage. The leading commodity here is milk. We do have some happy cows here. We have almonds that are over 1 million acres. In this state, we have a total of about 9.5 million acres. We also have grapes that are also over 1 million acres. So very large acreage of certain crops and very high value crops are produced in this state. So in 2015, the UN FAO Food and Ag Organization dedicated that year as the International Year of the Soils. And so the secretary and the governor at that time were interested in doing something further to support this endeavor and align with it. So it was a good time to think about soils. We had a drought here. Severe historic drought in California. In 2014 and 15 were really bad years. We had zero water allocation to farmers in those years. And so, when you think about healthy soils, you think about the water holding capacity and what that can do for your ag production. So there were several synergies on coming together in 2015. And as I mentioned, 2015, the UNFAO dedicated, this is Claire Chenou from France, who was Special Ambassador to the International Year of the Soils and a well-known advocate for soil and soil health. We're also lucky to have the University of California, Davis, where we have several professors and experts in microbiology and soil science. And also we have expertise, this is Dr. Kate Scow, and then we also have expertise. This is Jeff, who is really well known for his no-till and conservation tillage work here in the States. So we at times lead the nation or UC Davis leads the nation in academic excellence in agriculture. They share one and two as the best universities in the world, with Wageningen University in the Netherlands, just depending on the year. So 2015 was sort of when we started thinking about this. And there was also some policy mechanisms that this aligned well with. So so when we look at our greenhouse gas inventory, that is the image, the pie chart on the top left, agriculture comes out to be about 8% of emissions. And the pie chart is a little deceiving because the greenhouse gases are not entirely from animal agriculture. About half of the 8% is from animal agriculture and methane emissions. But the point is, we do have a greenhouse gas footprint in this state. We do have a cap and trade program, but agriculture is not part of that cap and trade program. So we were looking at this and, as transportation and industries under the cap and trade program, and as those cap and trade program works to address the emissions from 41% in reductions over time, what we didn't want to happen is for our agriculture footprint to grow from 8% to 9% to 10%. So we were thinking about different mechanisms at that time on how we can address these emissions, and the Healthy Soils Program and carbon sequestration is one. We hadn't previously seen things like carbon storage in the land base being added to sort of policy measures. So this was the first year, and that's the image down below with the red circle where carbon storage in the land base was added, really recognizing that carbon sequestration in soils is feasible and can be a positive influence in reducing greenhouse gases. We did also have some policy measures that the governors had put together. So Governor Schwarzenegger in 2006 had the 80% reduction target. And then Governor Brown came out and said, okay, we're going to do a 40% reduction target, an intermediate target from what Governor Schwarzenegger said. And then recently there was an executive order that talked about biodiversity and how soil health can really help in biodiversity and also provide greater environmental benefits. So a lot of good policy measures moving in the direction of this as well. And at the same time, there was some really valuable scientific resources coming out. This image on the right-hand side is called the Blue Book. This came out by USDA, and basically it quantified greenhouse gas fluxes in agriculture and forestry and set up good methodologies to do that. And so, and we also had this tool called Comet Planner come out at the time that actually took certain practices that were already recognized by USDA, Natural Resources Conservation Services, and put a greenhouse gas quantification value with it. So they said, basically, if you do this practice and you have so many acres, this is what you're going to end up with greenhouse gas savings. So there was very good scientific credibility happening behind this momentum that was carrying at the same time of 2015. And here's an example. This is reduce and tillage management, residue and tillage management. It's a conservation practice standard 329. It's not meant to test your eyes here by small font. It's simply an example of what was in those documents that were very good for us. So we kind of use these resources that came out at this time to build our program. Okay, so the Healthy Soils program stemmed from the Healthy Soils Initiative. And what the initiative was is in 2015, we looked at healthy soils, and this is sort of the diagram on the right-hand side. And we looked at some of these big things that it can help with, build soil organic matter, improve plant health and yield, improve water quality, provide water retention, help with sediment erosion, right? And so when we talked to our sister agencies, at that time, we thought maybe we're the only one interested in healthy soils. There was a lot of interest from our sister agencies, state agencies about this. For example, the Department of Pesticide Regulations was very interested in reduced sediment erosion because pesticides applied to soils, and if it's a healthy soils, they don't erode and they don't get in our waterways. And so the Water Board was also interested in that. So there was a lot of interest from different standpoints and agencies on the benefits of healthy soils. So one of the things that came out of our discussions with the sister agencies and this initiative was that we should set up an incentives program and a demonstration program. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Geetika Joshi to add more on the two programs.
Thank you, and good morning to all of the Assembly members and special committee members. My name is Geetika Joshi. I'm a senior environmental scientist at the Department of Food and Agriculture in California, and I oversee the implementation of the Healthy Soils programs, which includes two grant programs, as Dr. Gunasekar mentioned, one for incentives and the other are demonstration projects. The difference between the two programs really is in the scope and also who is eligible for funding. The incentives program is specifically designed to provide direct financial assistance to farmers and ranchers. They are eligible to get grants of up to $100,000 each to implement some of the specific practices that we know are proven to sequester soil carbon, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and build soil health. The demonstration projects, on the other hand, are designed primarily to promote education, outreach, and especially a farmer-to-farmer education on these healthy soils practices. So the eligibility is a little bit different. That folks who are eligible to get those funds are the folks who have capacity to put in these demonstration projects and conduct outreach events. So that could be farmers and ranchers, and they can collaborate with universities, with local resource conservation districts, with nonprofit organizations that have specialization in agricultural education and outreach, and so on. And so we provide two different types of demonstration projects. The first type, which has a higher funding amount of $250,000 available, are called Type A projects, which require that there be a collaboration with the university researcher, and they can collect data on actual greenhouse gas emissions and fluxes from the field sites and the demonstration plots. Type B projects are primarily focused on the education outreach component, do not require data collection, and those can provide up to $100,000 in award. And the logos on the right-hand side of the slide that you're seeing are two of the funding sources that have funded our programs till date. One is the California Climate Investments, also known as our cap and trade program that Dr. Gunasekar mentioned. Agriculture is not a regulated or a capped sector under cap and trade in California. However, when the revenues are collected and are available for investing in programs and projects that can reduce greenhouse gases, their agriculture does play a really important role in providing opportunities for reductions. The other source is called Prop 68, and this is a bond measure specifically for conservation of natural and recreational spaces in California that was passed in 2017. So next slide, please.
Hey, Geetika, let me just see if I duplicate the slideshow. Okay, is that better on the screen? Yep. Yeah. Okay, yep. Perfect. Great. I finally figured it out. Sorry about that.
Yeah, if you don't mind advancing the slide for me, please. Thank you. So this slide shows a snapshot summary of the work we've done so far through the Healthy Soils program. The program was, as Dr. Gunasekar mentioned, we started envisioning and developing it as far as back as 2015. The funding was received for the first time in 2016, and it took us some time to launch the program. And the first round of funds that were available for farmers to apply for was in 2017. Since 2017, we have funded 576 incentives projects directly to farmers and ranchers across the state, and 67 demonstration projects for a funding of $34 million and $8.2 million respectively. The map kind of shows how kind of north to south in California, we have project locations all over the state. But of course, our agricultural areas are very much concentrated in the central part of the valley, as well as the central coast area. So you'll see that there's more density of funded projects in those regions. These projects are associated with a greenhouse gas quantification piece. It's an estimated or a modeled way of calculating greenhouse gas reductions. So we do not, have the requirement that farmers have to quantify this at their field site, as they do not always have the scientific expertise or resources to do so. So it's a modeling-based estimation that is done upfront while designing their project. And the tool that is used to do that is the Comet Planner that we shared with you a couple of slides ago, based on those methodologies developed by the USDA, from the USDA Blue Book. So we have some estimated greenhouse gas reductions numbers for these programs on an annual basis, over 100,000 tons of GHG reductions from incentives projects, about 9,000 from the demonstration projects. And to put it in perspective, that kind of is equal or similar to a little over 24,000 cars being taken off the roads for a year. Or if we were to think of it in terms of carbon sequestration and forested lands, almost 150,000 acres of forested lands in a year. And these projects are also spread over a wide acreage so far, 54,000 acres of the incentive projects, and about 4,000 for the demonstration field sites. We have a list of practices that are funded through these programs, and we will look at those lists in a moment. But some of those practices that are very popular and that farmers have opted for in a large way over the years are application of compost to the soil, putting in cover crops during the winter season, and also planting hedgerows, which are woody and shrubby plants on the borders of the field, where they can, the roots of the plants help in the soil organic matter retention and adding to that soil organic matter and soil biological activity, but also sequesters carbon in their own biomass in the plants themselves. So that provides a good amount of carbon reductions there. So next slide, please. So these are a list of all of the practices that we incentivize through our programs. We will have a few more slides of these. Since we have such a diverse variety of agricultural commodities that are grown in California, we have row crops and field crops, and we also have orchards and vineyards and pastures and rangeland. So our practices are categorized for the program in those categories. So we have a cropland category, an orchard vineyard category, and then pasture and rangeland category. There are many practices that are common through these, but there are some that are unique to the particular type of cropping system that there might be. And while I won't go into individual details of every single practice that is listed here, I will talk a little bit about in terms of the categories. So there are practices that are specifically focusing on managing the soil on the farm, which can be done by planting cover crops. So instead of leaving the field fallow, putting in living roots in the field. So that's one type of category. Or by putting in carbon-rich soil amendments, like adding compost to the soil or adding mulch, and those can help kind of trigger that good soil microbes into metabolizing those carbon sources and turning them into more stable forms of carbon that we know as soil organic matter, which can persist in the soil for long periods of time. Another way to do this is to not disturb the soil itself too much. So that can be achieved by reducing the tillage or doing away with tillage altogether on the field. So that's another way or another type of practice. And then we have umbrella categories, which involve planting of a permanent herbaceous cover or a grass cover on parts of the field that are not in active production. So for orchards, this could mean the rows between the trees, or for other fields, it could field the border areas. And then a last category is similar to the grass cover, but instead of grass cover, it's planting permanent woody cover, so taller shrubs and trees. And those can, again, in the parts of the fields that are not in the active production zone. So adding that plant-based biomass and really triggering that soil microbial activity to get that organic matter and carbon sequestration going is pretty much the main concept behind a variety of these practices. If we could go to please the next slide. Thank you. So this again is a list of the practices. These ones are specifically designed for orchards and vineyards. So many of these are common with the previous slide, but one that we would like to highlight is called whole orchard recycling. This is a practice that was only approved for adding to the program in the last year. We have a lot of orchard crops in California, and when the trees age and need to be taken out, instead of burning those trees, they can be chipped and incorporated back in the soil. That adds carbon to the soil, but also has a really huge benefit of preventing burning related air pollution, which happens to be an issue of concern in California's Central Valley. The geography of the valley is such that smoke and dust particles tend to hang out there for a long time. So, not only can we achieve healthy soils, but can also tackle these other type of pollution problems with some of these practices in the Healthy Soils program. Next slide, please. So this is a list of practices that are specially designed for rangeland and grasslands and pastures. So again, many commonalities, but there are a few unique ones like prescribed grazing and silvopasture that are specifically for rangeland and grassland systems. Next slide, please. So this one, again, is a list of our demonstration program. So the demonstration projects fund all of those same 30 plus practices that are funded in the direct incentives. But at the same time, we also recognize that there is a need for evaluation of new practices that are not in the standard program framework, but have the potential of reducing greenhouse gases and building soil carbon and building soil health. Some of these practices are well known, or maybe there is data available scientifically that they can reduce greenhouse gases. But in many cases, the data may not be specific to California's type climate or systems or the types of crops we grow there. So we do have one ability in our type A demonstration projects. If you recall, these ones require collaboration with university researchers. Here's a subset of practices where we currently don't have published enough of a robust published data set to make a government program, but they could choose these practices and commit to actually collecting that data that we need through this program. So use some of those funds towards research that can in the future allow us a data set that helps us evaluate if we can expand the suite of practices through the program. So there are many practices here, for example, application of digestate from anaerobic digestion, which could come from municipal waste or manure, applying mycorrhizae to the soil, which are soil fungi that, again, they help plant roots and better plant growth and therefore better organic matter, and so on. So several special practices are also funded through this category and allow for data collection capability. Next slide, please. So this is an example of, this slide talks a little bit about our demonstration projects. And as I had mentioned earlier, demonstration projects are really key for farmer-to-farmer education. And when we think about long-term adoption of practices, a scientist such as myself or others on our team who are always sitting in our office often don't make the most compelling reason for a farmer to do something. What really appeals to them is if they see other farmers such as themselves, their farmers, doing something, it worked out for them, that can sometimes be the best education tool. And so our demonstration projects allow for having this on-farm education component. we require that there are mandatory on-farm field days that are conducted by the grant recipients for the demonstration projects. They must invite at least 120 different farmer and rancher attendees to their field days over a course of 3 years and showcase to them their project, show them the practice, how it was implemented, what worked, what didn't work, what were the challenges, how it was overcome, and what kind of benefits they saw in their own language and in their own way, so that they can kind of teach each other. And that can help us achieve that goal of long-term adoption potentially. And we have a list of field days that is constantly updated and posted on our website, as we have many awardees who conduct these field days at different points in time. If they have the ability, they also provide these field days in other languages. We have farmers who speak Spanish, Punjabi, Hmong, and many other languages in the state of California. So where possible, that help is available. And also, I would just like to add, in these days of COVID, when there's been a specific challenge in having these field days happen, we've had a lot of grant recipients, take some creative approaches, do online meetings and webinars, just like the one that we're having now, and still trying to conduct and, move forward and onward with their demonstration projects that way. So next slide, please. So this is a data snapshot of projects that have been funded through the program. This particular graph only shows the 2020 funded programs. We've been around longer than that. And the pie chart basically shows, the type of projects that the type of agricultural systems that are most adopting the projects. So as you can see, orchards and vineyards, we have a lot of those in California. So a lot of our subset of awardees also happen to be orchards and vineyards, and then croplands, grazing lands, or mixed systems. And in terms of acreage as well, orchards and vineyards kind of dominate that distribution. So number of projects as well as acreage just happens to be a reflection that those are the most common type of cropping systems we have in California currently. Next slide, please. So this pie chart shows, again, for the 2020 awarded projects, which are the practices that have been most common or most adopted by farmers through our program. Compost application with 257 projects out of 319, very, very popular practice. Cover crops is another one that's been taking off. Traditionally, cover crops were popular in the Midwestern United States and less in California. But as with funding available through our program, we've seen cover crop grow a lot in California, which is very exciting for us. And then there are practices like hedgerow planting, whole orchard recycling, as well as windbreak and shelter belt establishment, which is planting rows of trees on the fields that have been very popular. Next slide, please. So this screen just shows a snapshot of the Comet Planner tool that is used by applicants to estimate their greenhouse gas reductions when they apply to our program. So as we mentioned, Comet Planner was originally developed by USDA NRCS and Colorado State University. And currently, we also have a California-specific version of the Comet Planner tool. So this one is the National Comet Planner tool. But as you can see, if you look at the little menu up top, if you go to the USDA Comet Planner, there is a special link for the California Healthy Soils tool. I think if we click one more, it'll be highlighted. There we go. So folks can click on that Healthy Soil specific tool, and then next slide, please. And that takes us to this page, and you can see there's the CDFA logo on there. So that kind of shows that it's the California specific tool. And also in the choice for states, California is automatically filled out. So it's a very easy to use tool. A farmer has to pick a name for their project, choose the county, and then choose what kind of agricultural system they are in. Then a list of practices pops up, and they just have to simply choose which practice they would like to implement and enter the number of acres for that practice and hit enter, and it gives them the greenhouse gas data. And then they can just make a PDF file of that screen printout and include it as part of their application when they apply for funding through our program. So next slide, please. So this here, like I mentioned, it shows once someone chooses their agricultural system, there is the whole menu of all the available practices that pops up, and they can click and choose and then enter the acres in that blue highlighted box, and it automatically shows the calculations on the side. The Comet Planner tool also has a standard payment rate built in for each practice. So in that dark blue box on the very right-hand side, you can see it also automatically calculates how much of the grant dollars would those practices be eligible for that the farmer would be applying for. So it creates their greenhouse gas calculation and their budget all in the same tool. This again is a snapshot of what that Comet Planner output report looks like. This is also on the website for Comet Planner. It also lists all of the source documents and the scientific documents that are behind this methodology. So there are practices that are funded by the USDA NRCS programs as well that are from the Blue Book that we mentioned earlier. There are 2 practices that are currently not in the USDA set, but are there in the CDFA set. For compost application and whole orchard recycling. For those, CDFA has its own reports that summarize the scientific data that went behind these calculations, and those are also available on these links here. And finally, we should also talk about technical assistance. You know, when we first started the programs, we heard a lot from farmers that despite having a fairly simple tool for greenhouse gas calculation, there was still a great need for technical assistance for farmers to help them design their projects, conceptualize their projects, figuring out what kind of practices would make sense on their fields, and then preparing and submitting applications. So we have had technical assistance grants available for folks who have expertise in these types of agricultural expertise in agricultural systems that can help farmers submit these applications. So those could be your university cooperative extensions, or they could be resource conservation districts, which are semi-governmental organizations in pretty much every county in California. Or they could be any other nonprofits that have expertise as well. And we have had a separate grant program. So first we run with that grant program, get the technical assistance providers funded and trained and ready to go. And then we announce for the Healthy Soils funding so that those technical assistance providers can then assist farmers in applying to our programs. So currently, we also have an agreement with the University of California system where they have dedicated climate smart agriculture specialists for this task, in addition to the grants that we give out. So the map here shows all the counties where the UC specialists are available with their services. And then we also have a full list of technical assistance providers that are available. And these have been a great help to us because CDFA doesn't always have all of the capacity and boots on the ground support for farmers, but our technical assistance providers have conducted over 40 workshops and assisted hundreds of applicants to apply to our programs. And many of them have the ability to provide expertise in other languages as well, which has been really helpful. Next slide, please. So at this time, we can share a video of one of our funded recipients, and then I will hand it over to Dr. Gunasekara again for closing the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Joshi. This is a quick video from one of our growers on the Healthy Soils program. And one thing I would encourage you to do is look for when he talks about the multiple benefits.
So with Healthy Soil, it's not just about creating a good walnut. It certainly is. There are other benefits to it. It makes our job easier as farmers. We use less inputs. We sink more water. We create better nutrient density in our food. But at the same time, with Healthy Soil and with a no-till organic system, we're trying to use these trees to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and sink it into the soil where we hope that it stays. What's good for the soil is generally good for us. So every improvement we can make down here comes forth up here in better food, less inputs, better moisture and water retention, less pest pressure. So in our Healthy Soils project, we implemented cover crop and composting. In just 2 years, we're already seeing bumps in our soil organic matter. If we are increasing that, we're both increasing our sink, the amount of carbon that we can hold in the soil, and our store, the amount of carbon that we're putting into the soil. The Healthy Soils program really affirms these practices: composting, cover crop, no tillage, habitat, hedgerow restoration. these are all things that we want to engage with, we really believe in, and the Healthy Soils program gives us both the financial and some institutional support to enact them.
And I should say, members, that this program is not geared towards organic systems. It's both geared towards organic and conventional systems. It's really about building the carbon content in the soil to provide multiple benefits. So, I just want to summarize a few things that we have spoken of today. The incentive program really allows growers to try something new and learn about management practices that they might have not done before on the ag operations, and that hopefully will have both economic and multiple environmental benefits where they will try to continue to do that practice. We finally managed to tie soil management practices on farms with real carbon sequestration benefits. And that was a big momentum shift, I believe, in the state. We've shown that it contributes to climate change adaptation by increasing water holding capacity and also those multiple benefits that we highlight, but certainly helps with greenhouse gas mitigation and ag sustainability into the future as well. And then we talked about those multiple benefits that we talk about that we discussed today. One thing I want to share with you is the language behind the legislative statutory authority behind these programs. There was a Canela Senior who created the Canela Environmental Farming Act of 1995. It's in a CDFA statute, and it talks about the department, the California Department of Food and Agriculture, establishing an environmental farming program to provide incentives for various benefits that are highlighted here in that under section 566A. We also have a 9-member scientific advisory body that I'm the liaison to. And then what we do is we move our programmatic framework through this body, which is essentially a public facing body where we're able to also solicit public comment and have public comment periods on the written RFPs or the request for proposals. Also there's some other duties that this panel is supposed to do, but that's one of the main tie-ins on our incentive programs. And it also subsequently, since 1995, recently the language has been modified to include specific language on the Healthy Soils program and codify sort of the programs we established under this broad 566A statutory authority. So I want to end there, and before I end, I just want to thank a lot of folks who make this program run on a day-to-day. Some of these folks listed here help in other incentive programs as well, but we use their scientific and administrative skills to also support the Healthy Soils program. And certainly without them and their hard work, this program, and Dr. Joshi's hard work, this program would not be standing on its own. So thank you. At this time, we'll be available for any questions you may have.
Incredibly informative. I am certain that my committee members will have some questions, looking to the room to see who would like to go first. Minister.
Well, thank you, Chair, and yes, thank you so much for that presentation. It is, as you started off when you were talking about how it's a small world and we're able to work together, from California to Prince Edward Island. I have a very dear friend of mine who manages the certified farmers markets down in the Coachella Valley in Palm Springs, Pond Desert, and La Quinta. And so Megan Goring is her name. So if you're ever down in the area in the Coachella Valley, you go to the farmers market, ask for Megan, tell her I sent you. That'd be amazing. It is a small world, and if we all work together, we can make a difference. And a lot of the programs that you have here are things that we are doing in similar fashions on Prince Edward Island, but I think there's always room for improvement, and there's lots of ideas that we can steal here. I mean, one of the things, one of the questions I had was, when you're rolling out your programs and you have to evaluate the change in, for example, greenhouse gases for a particular farm, I guess, first of all, how do you do that to make sure that farmers are actually hearing? What's it?
I think that was their comment tool, but yes. Keep
Yes.
going.
And then what was the second question? But we'll start with that one anyway.
Well, I can get going, and then I'll have Dr. Joshi add some thoughts if she'd like. But thank you for that question, Honorable Minister Travers. So we do use so it's basically a projections on greenhouse gas reductions at the time of the application is an estimate. It's an estimate through modeling that we have done and added in Common Planner. So they'll pick the practice, and out will spit this greenhouse gas number that's based on sort of best available science to date. And it's a conservative number. Certainly it's not a high overestimation. It's a conservative number that those models project out. And then we ask them at a minimum to do the practice for 3 years. So the science has shown that, with quantification and carbon sequestration of carbon, you need a minimum of 3 years to see some sort of changes that's beyond the scientific variability from year to year ag systems or year to year scientific standard deviation associated with changes in carbon. Ideally, we would like to take that over a longer period of time, but monies allocated don't allow us to go beyond 4 years. So 3 years is sort of the limit we can go for. And then they do the practice for 3 years. At the end of each year, they send us a soil sample, and then we evaluate those soil samples to see if there's some benefit. We're kind of getting them all over the place right now in terms of results. So we still have to fine tune the soil sampling piece. But the biggest thing is the modeling is supported by a verification component where at the end of that year, we go out there and we do a verification that the practice was implemented. We take some photos of photographs of what was implemented, and those photographs are geotagged so we can associate the location with the field. And then that's sort of a verification piece that, the practice was done. And like I said, we hope that these folks try this and farmers see the value both maybe economically and also environmentally and continue to do it. I will say there are these co-benefits that we haven't highlighted from an economic perspective. For example, if you do conservation tillage or no tillage, one thing we hear a lot of is the reduced fuel use from tractor passes that growers save on. So those are sort of the non-quantified benefits that also happen that we hope growers see. Geetika, do you want to add anything? Please go ahead.
No, I think that covered well. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, and that makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking with the vast quantity of farms that you have in California, it would take a lot of resources in order to do the calculations and the verification. But it does sound like you have really great modeling tools like the Common Planner to help you with that. And that's definitely something, even on an island like Prince Edward Island, we have challenges with. I really, I'm interested in how you are able to use photography as well, photographs that are geotagged to do that. I know we do satellite imagery of Prince Edward Island, and there's some questions whether that's to the proper resolution to allow us to do that sort of, calculation to look at cover crops and things like that as well. But I'd be interested in actually seeing, not in the standing committee meeting, but sharing the technical details between, say, the Department of Agriculture, Department of responsible for climate change, to see if there's a way Prince Edward Island could leverage some of the techniques you were doing, because if you are sending people out physically to go and and look at every farm, I could imagine you would run out of resources very, very quickly. Can you comment on the amount of resources it takes to manage a program like this in a state the size of California?
Yes, thank you, Honorable Minister Trivers, for that question. It's a great question. So we are legislatively allowed to only use 5% of the funds we get. So, if we get $10 million, well, we only able to use 5% of that for administrative costs. It does cost some money to go out and verify, but if we're going out for a verification, we tie in 3 to 5 other farms where we can then do the verification and have more efficiencies involved with that. One thing I will say is prior to COVID-19 times, we were going out to farms because we wanted to also establish this connection with growers and hear from them on a more personal level how they're feeling about the program. Beyond our standard questionnaire. And after COVID-19 times, we switched to more remote video verifications where we call the grower on the phone and he walks us through the field and shows us what he's done. And then we can also ask our questions and build a rapport with that farmer and get his feedback as well. So we have changed our verification protocols a little bit. That also help us save some money there. But all our programs, we have 5% administrative costs that pay for all that and our team members' time and everything else that goes into sort of running this program, including building up the Common Planner tool. We will certainly be happy to share any and all of this information we have. Nothing is top secret to us. So we look forward to further discussions with your teams.
Brad?
Well, thank you so much. It's pretty incredible that you're able to keep that administrative fee down to 5%. And that's definitely something, as we look forward to times when maybe the pandemic isn't upon us, to have you guys come back to Prince Edward Island. I know you said you're here as youth. I'm the MLA that has actually Cavendish and the land of Anne in my district, so I'd love to host you, and I'm sure we could all go out for a nice lobster dinner too. Thank you.
Steve.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, I appreciate the comments.
Thank you, Chair. So how much, did I hear that this is funded through the carbon cap and trade, your carbon pricing mechanism you have in place?
Yes, great question. So our main funding source where we've got the most amount of money is, through the revenues that come through the cap and trade program. So I'm sure you all know about the cap and trade program, that there are a cap on certain industries and they have to pay for permits to reduce those emissions if they can't with new technology. And so that revenue that comes in through our cap and trade program goes into the California Climate Investment Fund. And the California Climate Investment Fund is sort of a separate account that then the departments kind of apply to and say, hey, for our sectors, we can reduce greenhouse gases further. Here's a proposal that we are putting forward to do that. And then those monies are sort of distributed based on the proposals. And so the Healthy Soils program is just one of those proposals. It varies, the funding varies from year to year based on interest and priorities. We certainly didn't get any funding this past year because of COVID-19 economic issues. The cap and trade program revenues were down. And then, in that case, we don't have any funds. But I think what our program highlights, and I think what's important to note is that with these programs, you can use a lot of other funding sources. So we have made it so that it's eligible to be used as bond programs too. There's opportunities for green bonds also to be used on this because of the large benefits. So the program structure is just really flexible to accommodate a lot of different sources of funding. But yes, mainly from the cap and trade program and bond funds so far.
Thank you, Chair. So on a year like this where you don't have any funding going out, Does that disrupt payments going out to people participating in these programs?
Certainly, what I will say is this current year, it's not impacted so much because we take about 12 months to get the previous grant dollars out. So we have a solicitation, we have an administrative review process, we have a technical review process, and then we have an announcement. And so that all takes, and then we have to establish contracts before they can start the practice, grant contracts, that is, with the farmer. So that all takes anywhere from 12 to 16 months. So we, even though we didn't get funding, we're still working on that solicitation which we just got out. And then there's certainly there's going to be a year that we don't have funding. We did have a year in the past where we didn't have funding, but that just nothing stops. That just allows us to provide further program improvements for the next solicitation and to get it ready. Plus, our team's busy now with all those projects that the contracts just got approved. We have to do invoicing and verifications, and that there's a lot of contracts and grants to manage. So from an administrative standpoint, things don't really slow down, but it does give us an opportunity to sort of help build additional tools. So one year we didn't have funding in the past. We took the time to build this tool called the Replan tool. And it's basically, the growers have to tell us where their APNs or Sicily parcel numbers are, basically where their farm field is. And so they had to go to this complex mapping tool that was really frustrating to them, or they had to draw it out on a piece of paper. And it was not very easy. So it was very frustrating for them, and then have to attach it to the application portal. So we took the time during that downturn to sort of develop this nice, easy to use, user-friendly tool. So they use the Common Planner tool, they use the Replan tool, they use the application, they tie that into a package, and boom, they submit it. So we take the time to provide further improvements to the program. And trust me, stakeholders are continually asking to make the program even more user-friendly. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Steve.
Thank
I
you,
would
Chair.
like to add.
Apologies. Yes, of course.
Yeah, but each grant is 3 years long for an individual farmer. So to clarify, the folks who have already been funded, they are good for 3 years, even though we have a funding gap right now. So the farmers who are already into the program, we don't have a concern for them to not get paid. We are just in a little bit of a gap for funding even more additional folks. So to clarify that.
That's an important clarification. Thank you. Steve.
Thank you, Chair. That is important. That's what I was wondering, is if the end users saw disruption in the payments that were coming through the program. Is there a certain value per ton of greenhouse gas emissions sequestered that you would pay out?
Same question.
Yes, there is. There's a payment per practice, and those payment per practices are it's established by USDA and RCS, and they pay 50% of the practice. We pay 100% of that cost. So different practices has different payment rates. And what we do is those payments are not necessarily directly compared to CO2. Those are compared to what it takes to implement the practice. However, since we have the Common Planner tool, at the end of the day, we can take the total amount dollars and look at the carbon sequestration and say, okay, how much did it cost per ton of carbon for this program? So that's how we that's how we relate it back to the carbon sequestration equivalency piece. Geetika, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, that would, I would like to add, I think it's important to remember that when we talked about the different categories of practices, each category, the potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is different. If you're planting a tree or a woody cover, you're not only activating the root system and the soil microbes and soil organic matter, you also just have the sheer woody biomass of the tree, which is sequestered carbon. So you could envision that the carbon sequestration there is very different and just not on the same scale as reducing tilling on your farm, for instance, or adding smaller plants through cover crops that are seasonal. That said, each and every of those practices is very important in providing a suite of options to the farmer, and that they can choose multiple of those practices. So in our program, we also very importantly try not to make the practices compete against each other by way of how there are tons of greenhouse gas reduction. We encourage growers to adopt as many of those practices as they can. And when we review the applications for their competitiveness, we're not looking at the magnitude of those greenhouse gases. We are looking at the whole farm plan, all of the different practices they can implement, their project design overall, and how technically sound it is, and things like that.
Steve.
Thank you, Chair. So that sounds like we could have various different costs for implementation, and you're going to, I wasn't quite clear on the amount you'd provide, but let's say it's 50%, and whether that's 50% of the cost of growing some trees or 50% of the cost of changing your tilling procedures or techniques, that's what would be offered, with no discrimination towards the one that's going to cost less per greenhouse gas ton. Is that accurate?
That, Geetika, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah, that is accurate. You captured it well. And yes, the cost, as Dr. Gunasekara mentioned, comes from our sister agency, United States Department of Agriculture, and their programs. And they take into account the cost of practice implementation. It includes cost for equipment, labor, and other types of expenses. So each practice, depending on how labor intensive it is, could have a different payment rate. And again, we encourage folks to consider any and all practices that could go on their farms.
Well, compared to others, it occurs to me that running out of funding is going to become quite an issue if you have a lot of farmers that choose the more capital intensive option, and you might end up with less impact and more capital going out. Is it regular for this, or normal for this program to be fully subscribed or oversubscribed and run out of funds?
Yes, that is a really great question. It's a two-part question. So the first part is that we deal with the differences in the cost by putting an overall cap on the grant. So we say you're only eligible to get up to a total of 100,000 and no more. And each practice is linked to a standard payment rate, which is by per acre. So a farmer would have to determine if, for example, if it's a more expensive practice, they might get fewer acres of that practice in. If it's a less expensive practice, maybe they could get more acres in, but in the end, they could get to a similar number in dollars. And just having that diversity of farms and different farm sizes, and just the sheer number of farms that we can fund, hopefully, we try to minimize that cost on the impact, as you mentioned. And the second part question, sorry, I'm forgetting a little bit what the question was on the second part.
Steve?
What was the second part?
Oversubscribed.
I can answer that. You were talking about the oversubscription rate. Yeah, so Assemblymember Howard, we are very oversubscribed. I will say this about all our incentive programs. When you start the program, you don't get a huge oversubscription rate. Growers watch and see what this program's about for about a year and a half. And then they obviously talk to their peers. And then what we see with our incentive programs, it sort of takes off. We have on average an oversubscription rate now for our incentive programs that range anywhere from 200% to 400% as an approximation, depending on the year. And so the Healthy Soils program was not oversubscribed hugely when we first started, but now, Geetika, I don't know, I don't remember what the exact number was. Do you know, was it closer to 400 this time?
Yeah, so this year we were able to fund 319 applications, but we received 617 applications. So about twice as much that we could fund.
Yeah, so it's become very popular, and with the popularity comes also a further ask, not from us, from stakeholders, to the legislators and governors to continue to fund these programs. Now, we have almost 70,000 farms in this state, and we don't expect to fund or cover all of them. That's going to take a lot of money, and so one thing I think is the important messaging, the Department of Food and Agriculture sends in trying to highlight the benefits of doing healthy soils practices for various reasons. And so, we imagine a continuation of funding, but, that we can continue the program and continue to tell farmers the good stories that come out of this. I know that video was a little patchy, and I hope you heard the words, but that's sort of what we're trying to get to, is having growers really see for themselves the benefits on their farm and then adopting it on their future on a voluntary basis over a longer period of time.
And I'm just going to jump in and want to ask one quick clarification question. We spoke to farmers being eligible for up to $100,000, and I'm curious if that's per year or over the course of 3 years.
That is over the course of 3 years, so that's the total grant.
Thank you. Steve, did you have further questions?
Thank you, Chair. So I think I heard that agriculture is not a regulated industry under your cap and trade system, and yet you're using revenue from that cap and trade system to go feed into the agriculture industry. I'm just wondering, is there some sort of displacement that happens within the other industries that you don't have funding for programs within the industries that are participating in the cap and trade system?
That's a good question, Assemblymember Howard. Thank you for that question. There are certainly efforts from the other sectors to solicit proposals to further the environmental footprint on those sectors. There's no doubt about that. One of the largest one of the largest entities that get funding here is the transportation sector with their high-speed rail project that gets a large chunk of those revenues. If you look at the total revenues that come into the cap and trade program and our programs, the Healthy Soils program is not a big ask. We're several million, but there are a lot of other big projects. So we started with an idea. We started small. We got a 7.5 million allocation at the first. We try to prove these concepts through some smaller investments at first, and then if it's successful, it sort of builds out from there. Really what happens is it's if stakeholders like it, they'll advocate for it. That's sort of how it goes. Rachel, did you have something to add to that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, happy to add to that. One of the goals for the state of California is actually to take the cap and trade revenues from the auctions and apply it to the non-cap sectors. So the cap sectors are paying for the credits, trying to obviously bring down their emissions, over time to meet the goals that the state has laid out. And the early mechanisms for the program was to actually take that revenue and then fund projects that could continue to reduce emissions in other sectors. So you already had the cap sectors who were being mandated to reduce their emissions, and then we would take that revenue and pair it with programs that could also overall reduce emissions in the state of California. There's been some flexibility in the last couple of years that's been built into that. For example, one of the cap sectors, it's a very small portion of the cap sectors, is some food processors in the state. And there was a program from a couple of years ago that did get some funding to go towards advancements in boiler systems or other types of advancements in technology that food processors could use to help reduce their emissions. So that flexibility kind of came in the last couple of years, but overall the kind of ethos of the program has been to take the money from the cap sectors and to put it into these other areas, specifically like Dr. Gunasekara mentioned, which is the transportation sector. Obviously is one of the largest sectors of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And so there's kind of been that flexibility built in to hopefully help overall reduce emissions in the state. And I hope that helps answer your question.
Steve.
Thank you, Chair. That was good clarification. How to ask that? I can really appreciate the fact that you put some dollars into encouraging farmers to change their practices, and in doing so, that they're going to get a certain amount per ton that they've sequestered, or based on their capital expenditures. And the hope is that the side effects of that would be improved soil health and better yields for the farm, those kinds of things that wouldn't necessarily be captured in a dollar per ton of greenhouse gas emissions offset. But I am wondering if you do have any numbers relating to that, of just in some sense of how many dollars per ton of greenhouse gas sequestered a program like this is affecting upon your total inventory.
Yeah, thank you, Assembly Member Howard, for that question. We do have $1 per ton, so we take the total dollars allocated for the grants, and then we divide that by certainly, or we measure that against the total carbon sequestration benefits. And Geetika, do you remember what the last calculation was? I think it's around, is it around $40 a ton? We can do yeah.
I don't have the exact number, but it's in that ballpark of $40 to $50 a ton. It's, I think in case of especially the Healthy Soils program, it's important to point out that when we compare the dollar per ton numbers, a lot of times we are comparing with other programs that do only large scale mitigation. But there is a real unique opportunity here with the storage of carbon long-term in the land. So even though the cost or dollar per ton might seem a little bit on the higher end, especially if we compare it to the dollar per tons that are available in the cap and trade market for the credits, which is around $10 to $12 per ton, there's definitely this added benefit. And of course, the unquantified but well-documented co-benefits that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Steve? You're good for now. Ola, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Chair. It's really fascinating that the soil can actually sequester carbon. I was wondering, is there any upper limit on how much the capacity of the soil per acre, how much it can actually store additionally? How much can you put into the soil?
Yeah, I mean, I can add some information. Thank you for that question, Assembly Member, and then I'll turn it over to Geetika to add her thoughts as well. So, our soils in California range from the carbon content, which is what we're really focusing on, range in general for our ag soils anywhere from 0.1% to 4%. And so, we're not trying to move these to like peat soils where we have 20% or greater carbon. But the point is, how can we build it up to sort of a 4 or 5% level over time? We don't have any set goals. There is policy discussions happening on what might be a good level. But we have over 2,500 different soils in this state, and I think one of those images I really want to highlight is we're a very big landmass and very diverse soil systems. We get very hot. We get lots of sunshine here. We don't have rain for a good 6 months out of the year. And so, the challenges of building the soil organic matter might be different from some other places that get rain during the year, because it's definitely tied also to moisture and the topography and where you are, etc. So The goal here is can this program over time ensure that there are some practices that are incentivized where growers learn about and see the benefits and continue to do that practice over time. And further, one thing that the demonstration projects are meant to do is also show those co-benefits that come out of it, such as increased water holding capacity. And they also do measurements on greenhouse gases so that we can take those then greenhouse gases data and sort of strengthen our modeling even further for each of those practices. So, we don't have a target. We're just highlighting the importance of this medium as a primary food growing medium. It ties into food security. And, we're just seeing how this program goes and how we can continue to enhance the carbon piece of soils.
Ola.
Did you want to add anything?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, just a little addition. So very important to think about the diverse soil types and climate, and having or not having those carbon sequestration goals. Another angle is, can we saturate the soil with all the carbon that we need so that it would not store anymore? And that's also a possibility, but it could take several decades of a time frame to get to a saturation point. And it's very difficult to achieve that in agricultural land where the soil is not undisturbed and only sequestering. It's an actively managed soil that is also giving us an output year after year. So there's a lot of potential, especially in agricultural soils, to continue to store carbon over the long term and adding more while maybe not reaching that full saturation potential. So something important to consider there as well.
That. Ola.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks, Chair. There's obviously great benefits to having high organic matter in the soil from other consideration than carbon sequestration. My question was, you're obviously adding organic matter according to your literature here, like manure, for instance, which would tend to break down. So my question is how long-lasting is the effect? You put it into the soil, but is it gone in another year or two? And once you keep the soil at a good level?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's actually a topic of active research as well. So carbon and soil organic matter, there are different fractions in that carbon input that we put in. One, we called it the labile carbon, which is the more simpler type of carbon molecules. So organic matter is very complex and it has a very complex chemical structure. There are portions of it that the soil microorganisms and plant roots can use very quickly. And it can, it could get added to the soil, and portion of that carbon could be very quickly metabolized. And, when anything breeds in the soil, just like us, it releases some of that CO2 back. So that can happen. But that, the elevated metabolism of those soil microbes, it also goes through biological transformation where that some of that organic matter that we add can be changed into even more recalcitrant forms of carbon that are more persistent. And also through a soil column, again, depending on the type of soil there is, how much irrigation, some of those more stable type of carbon can be stored deeper in the soil layers, which is not as affected as easily as some of the upper soil layers when we do farming related activities on the soil. So it really depends on the types of practices. Some practices such as adding more carbon and compost, for example, the process of preparing compost already stabilizes a lot of the carbon in that process. And then when that stable form is added, there's potential to sequester more. Manure, on the other hand, is a less stable form of carbon. It has more nitrogen and it can be more labile and quickly dissipated. So it depends on the type of practice that is being implemented, but of course also on the type of soil on which that practice is going, and also what kind of agriculture will then be occurring on that soil. It would be different in a pasture than, say, versus a crop that's harvested annually versus an orchard system. So all those factors come into question So it's a really great question. It's not easy to have a one size fits all answer for it. But our approach is, again, to do on each farm by farm basis, and each farm develops a design and a plan for their own farm and the type of system they have, and try to increase the soil organic matter, no matter where they are to start with, but just try to increase it from there and go from there.
Ola.
So if I understand that right, it's really the ideal situation is that you raise the carbon content on a permanent basis by permanently changing the practice of tilling the soil. I was wondering if you have considered options like biochar, which is a really long-lasting soil amendment, and that would sequester for a longer time.
Yes, that's a great comment, and biochar is something that we are actively been hearing a lot about. The only reason it's currently not part of the program is because we do not have enough published scientific data that can be used in our model in the Comet Planner tool to come up with a greenhouse gas estimation number. One of the reasons for that is that biochar made from different sources or different type of agricultural residues can vary greatly in its ability to sequester carbon. So we are very open to continue to monitor the research that's coming out on biochar, and as soon as we can have a data set that we can use for our modeling purposes, we would be very open to it. But I would also request Dr. Gunasekar to add more to that.
Yeah, thank you, Geetika. Thank you, Assemblymember Hamalan, for that question also. So let me add two things to that. So we recently, every couple of years, we have a new practice solicitation. And so one of the proposals, we just say, hey, what do folks want added to the Healthy Soils program? What other practices interest you? And for this round, we do have this past solicitation on the new practices. We do have proposals to consider on biochar. So we are taking a look at that. If we don't have enough information to put it into the incentives program, we have the potential to park that practice in the demonstration program. And the demonstration program then has a more research associated component also, where additional data can be collected to further that practice and get the scientific data and rigor that's necessary to recognize the practice. Another important piece about biochar is we need a use application rate for the different cropping systems. And that hasn't been developed yet at the university academia level. So what I mean by that is when we incentivize these practices, for example, compost is a good example. Before we incentivized compost, we didn't have a use application rate, which means, hey, for this crop, how much compost do we add to it? So we went through a process to gather that information and come up with a tonnage amount that we will fund per farm. So you can't come in and ask for 50 tons of compost for the program, because if people did that, then all we will fund is compost. So we have a set rate for rangelands and for croplands that we will fund up to. Now, certainly the grower can use his own funds to do more, which could benefit, but we only have a set rate. So biochar doesn't have that use application rate. And so, we have to be careful when we think about supporting some of these practices, that there are these levels, because we don't want folks adding too much and impeding water quality. We don't want folks adding too much or too little and impeding yield growth and crop and plant quality for that matter. So there's these agronomic pieces of the puzzle that also need to be addressed as we incentivize these practices. We don't have to do it for all the practices. It's just those practices that have a sort of application rate that this needs to be considered. I believe people are working on this. We also have sort of a scientific work group that's looking at biochar to see if we can come up with some of these practice numbers. But the science, as Dr. Joshi mentioned, is just not there yet. So that's been a little bit of a struggle. I should say the last thing is we do have a definition in our statute on biochar that happened a couple years ago, that it should be at least 60% carbon, so that at least there's some sort of standardization with the material on what we are talking about in terms of biochar. So that's a new statute that was added a few years ago, because even that didn't exist before that. Thank you.
One last question. I noticed you had no-till down as one of the measures, and that always makes me worry. How do they keep control of the weeds? And is Roundup involved in the no-till? Is that an issue?
I will say a few things on that, and then see if Dr. Joshi has anything to add to that. So on no-till, what we are finding is that there are specialized equipment that can help in the no-till system. For example, there are these, if you're doing no-till and cover crops, there's some equipment called drill seeding where, you can still, in those systems that have still cuttings on the ground, able to get your seeds in the ground and get them up in the spring. So we don't advocate for any pesticides to be used when they're doing our practices. That's certainly a grower decision, but our system, our incentive says, okay, you follow a recipe, and the recipe is sort of defined by USDA and RCS on here's what you can and can't do. And so it goes through it and it defines, look, here's your system, here's what you can do. You have to leave this and this on the ground. You can't till. You can't disturb the soil. So the goal is to really not disturb the soil. And there is equipment and strategies to then continue to work in those systems where you don't disturb the soil. That's not limited to pesticide use by any means. Geetika, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think the other piece is that while there is a potential to sometimes increase herbicide use, as you mentioned, but there's also a potential to not do that by combining the no-till practice with other types of practices that could potentially help in weed suppression. So we have definitely come across some farmers, especially in orchard systems, where they would have been tilling earlier just to take care of to keep the rows clean, or to keep the weeds low, that they have tried to do other practices such as implementing a cover crop or a permanent grass cover, and they can choose specifically the types of species that can help provide a healthy competition to the weeds and kind of suppress them. So there are definitely strategies out there that could be thought of to address this type of issue. And of course, all pesticide use in California farms is also regulated. So the scope for kind of drastically increasing kind of pesticide use in a way that could be not manageable, that's definitely under the usual permitting and licensing umbrella within the regulatory systems as well. And the program is not just for organic growers, it's for conventional as well. So we recognize that there are some strategies that farmers need, tools in their toolbox. But even with having all those, can they still work on carbon sequestration? I guess that's the larger driving question.
Thank you.
Sydney.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for your presentation. I appreciate it. I'm going to follow up quickly on a few of Steve's questions as well. The Healthy Soils Program, incentive program, up to $100,000. Is there any requirements on behalf of the applicant with that $100,000? Is it a percentage breakdown, or is it as long as it's under $100,000 they can get it, or do they have to have matching funds?
We do not require matching funds as part of the program, but in many cases, folks do come up with matching funds as, depending on the part of California they're in, we come up with the cost that's average, but in some regions, it might not be covering all of their costs, depending on labor costs in the region. So we do not have a match requirement, but we've seen many folks do pitch in a good amount of match with their projects. The $100,000 is just a maximum cap. And as we mentioned, each practice has a standard payment rate. So it's not necessary that every farmer would be getting $100,000. It would all depend on which practice they chose and how many acres of it. And as long as it's under $100,000, it could get funded. So it's a little bit of a.
So we have seen, yeah, Assemblymember McCohen, thank you for that question. We have seen projects that have asked for, you know, $4,000, $7,000, and it's still worth their while to go through the application and ask for those practices to try them out. So it's a very, very wide range between a few thousand to $100,000. I will also say that the $100,000 cap, it wasn't always $100,000. We have sort of experimented with different cap levels. We have, tried 50,000, we had tried 75,000, we have 100,000. And I think what sort of drives that is basically also the total amount of allocation we get. We definitely see a distribution in farm sizes, and with the cap being changed, certainly some larger farms might not be interested if you're offering a lower cap, but then the lower cap may cater to a lot of medium to smaller size farms. So it just depends. We ended up sort of at a 75,000 and 100,000 as sort of the sweet spot so far for the Healthy Soils program.
Thank you for that. The breakdown of the Healthy Soils program, you went into the practices by cropland, orchards, vineyards, grazing lands, and then you have charts that show the breakdown by project selected. So for example, in the incentive program, by far and away the largest program access was the compost application. And Steve, I think, was getting at this earlier, do you break that down by greenhouse gas reductions? Like, which of the, and going back to your first chart as well, where you, on page 14, I believe, where you say there's $34 million awarded over 3 years for an equivalent of 103,000 metric tons greenhouse gas reduced. Do you break that down by program for the most successful program for reducing greenhouse gas emissions?
So yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for that. So once again, I think we will talk a little bit about how all of the different practices have a different tons of carbon dioxide reduction associated with them. And the choice that a farmer might be making to choose a practice is not driven by how much carbon they can reduce, but rather which practice makes most sense on their type of farming system. Depending on where they're located, what type of crops they're growing, compost could be, or if they're located close enough to a composting facility to source the compost, it might be a really great choice for their program, for their farm, whereas there might be other farms that might be more interested in other practices. So we don't compare, we look at the overall greenhouse gas reductions for each farm and for the program as a whole, but we try not to break it down by individual practices, because as I mentioned earlier, some practices which involve planting of trees, they could sequester so much more carbon that if we try to make a graph of those practices next to other practices which are about the soil itself, such as compost or no-till, the tree planting practices would look like the most efficient ones. But that said, the reality is that the tree planting only occurs in strips that are on the borders of the farm, or other places which are not the active production part of the farm. So it's in the agricultural point of view, it's almost not very fair to compare the practices that enhance the productive part of the land versus the non-productive part of the land. So we try not to do it like that. But we do have numbers available if you're interested, like those types of each farm, the practices, their implemented acres and greenhouse gases, those numbers are certainly available at the farm level with us. And yeah, if there is a need and future meetings or discussions that we have that you would like to share, like us to share or show those numbers, we would be able to do that.
And Assemblymember McQueen, let me say this: with our program, we aggregate the numbers and do the carbon sequestration benefits and the greenhouse gas reductions, because at a program level, we report that back to the Yar Resources Board, the California Yar Resources Board, and they sort of provide oversight on the California Climate Investment Fund. And what they do is they collect from all those different sectors that now are using the revenue on these programs, and they put together an annual report. And in the annual report, they list the programs and sort of the total greenhouse gases reduced, so that they can go back and say, okay, here's the revenue that was sort of spent on these programs, and here's sort of a total CO2 reduction that you're getting from this. And certainly the cost per practice or the cost per program vary significantly. Some are more expensive than others. But the overall goal is sort of working to reduce GHGs on the farm, or greenhouse gases on the farm. Thank you for the question.
Sydney.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you. I can completely appreciate the bigger question of just letting as many farmers as possible access it, and for all kinds of different methods so that they can reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And also the bigger picture is, yes, you might reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but the bigger bang for the buck, or I shouldn't say bigger bang, but the healthy soil is huge in this whole aspect. You're not just trapping carbon. And of course, as legislature, what we're trying to do is find out actually where we can get our biggest bang for our buck as well on it. So it's good to know, where you're seeing that. In your breakdowns, when you do talk about practices for the croplands, and you have a couple of categories for no-till, can you tell me what your, who are those farmers that are accessing the no-till programs? What do they look like in California?
Geetika, do you want to take that?
Sure, I can speak a little bit, and then maybe you can add more. I would say, I think just, again, I'm just speaking from memory, and we might have to look at the each individual project data, but no-till is very popular, especially for our orchard and vineyard type of operations, where they have rows of land in between rows of trees or grapevines, where they have the ability to plant strips of grass or achieve minimize tillage in those strips of land, while the tree crop or the vine crop is growing on the side. We've also seen with some of our university extension work over the years that has worked on no-till, has also been really popular with cotton growers. And Ami, if you would like to add more to that.
Yeah, so I think the concept here, Assemblymember McQueen, is the field crops. Okay, so we do have some field crops in this state. Okay, they're not all specialty crops. We have forage that's grown for cattle and animal operations. There's watermelon. There's a lot of field crops that are also grown on this. So one of the things this practice is trying to promote is how can those field crops continue to operate, but include a no-till component to it. So there's sunflowers that's grown for birdseed and oil, and a whole bunch of other field crops that we're trying to have folks think about. Well, is there a mechanism that we can use to show that there still can be, because when you think, okay, let me say this way: when you think about tillage and the Dust Bowl, that all started from field crops. That all started from tilling the prairie soils up to plant these large field crops, and so that's sort of a piece that we can certainly see some improvement on building carbon. So it just happens that some of our orchard and vineyard and other crops also have no-till systems that are really good environmentally and have many co benefits. But I think the focus on putting that practice is, really how do we further those field crops to continue to do some no-tillage and not disturb the soil. That's sort of the core concept behind that practice.
Sydney?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I don't know if this is a fair question or not, but the compost industry, did you have enough for your program, or is there an industry that has been spurred on by perhaps some of the programs that you supply?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Assemblymember McEwen. That's a great question. So this incentivizing of compost is sort of a bigger policy effort to move food waste away from landfills in the state of California, trying to set up a supply by simply moving food waste from landfills, because the landfills generate greenhouse gases from food waste as well. So, you don't want to do one solution and have another problem. So we're trying to do solution win-wins on multiple sectors. And then how we come into play is we sort of set up this demand side of things, where folks then can be ready to take that supply and then use that supply. Now, one of the challenges we have here is the supply side of compost comes from your urban cities and entities, right? And our ag systems is not close to those sectors. And so what we also incentivize is on-farm composting. So instead of burning your residue, can you think about composting it? Because as Dr. Joshi mentioned, we don't want burning in this state because of the air quality issues in this valley, which is surrounded by mountains. The Central Valley is where we grow most of our food, but it's surrounded by these mountains. And so the air can't move out of there on a continuous basis. So it basically sits there. And so the burning adds particulate matter, which has serious health concerns. And so we now incentivize on-farm compost, but we also want the ag sector to be there ready to take this compost. Now, more directly on your question is, are people finding it easy to get compost or difficult? That depends on where they are. So we have, if you're in the valley, we have seen that there's a huge issue on getting that compost. We have some animal operations that are also creating compost. And so those can be eligible for the practices, for the healthy soils practice as well. And we have a similar program called the Alternative Manure Management Program, where we incentivize folks to use the dairy manure to create compost, and then that's another supply piece of it that exists. We have heard from some growers that if they are in more remote parts of the state and doing ag, that they have some challenges getting the compost, but it's not a regular issue or a daily for a lot of our projects. A lot of our projects are having no problem getting compost. I think what this shows is that growers understand the importance of compost, and they've always been, it's a very good agronomic practice that folks or farmers associate with. So there's some sort of systems already for the existing ones, but we want to sort of build that up more. Is sort of one of the goals of having that practice incentivized under the Healthy Soils Program.
Thank you so much for this. It's been incredibly helpful. I have been saving my questions till the end, and my colleagues did ask some of them, but I do still have a number of questions I'd like to go over with you, if I may. For context, agriculture is our second greatest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in our province. So recently, our committee has been really interested in looking at the opportunity to use soils here instead of as a source of carbon emissions, instead as an opportunity to sequester them. So this conversation has been incredibly useful. I'm sure you have seen that we are particularly interested in the quantity of carbon that can be sequestered in soils because of that context, of course, but we're also well aware of the potential co-benefits of changing farming practices and building soil. So for context, that's why we have been so focused on that particular side of it. I've never seen the Comet planning tool before. I think that's a really unique and powerful mechanism by which you can move these things forward. I did wonder how farmers were expected to quantify the amounts of carbon that they could be sequestering or choose the pathways that they could be following. And I see this tool as a really powerful way of helping to make that accessible. I am curious if the context of the Comet Planner is particularly geared to the United States, or if its general best management practices could be applied in any sort of North American context.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Land. I'll happy to add some comments, and I'll let Dr. Joshi add her thoughts as well. So, when Comet, Comet plan as a standalone program without the California Healthy Soils piece is really designed to address the whole nation. And that's what USDA does. They are sort of a federal entity. So when they build things, they build it for the nation. What we did is work with those folks to kind of create, and so now on the Comet Plan, you can still go to a California one that applies just to the nation. But if you want to go to the Healthy Soils program piece, you have to sort of use a different link that takes you to this different piece that has built out additional things into Comet Planner. And we really appreciate the flexibility of USDA and Colorado State University for working with us to build out that separate piece that puts in not only practices that are specific also to our program. For example, compost, right? Compost is, the USDA didn't have a compost practice, so they had to sort of build that practice out in Comet Planner for us. So rather than building it out for a national audience, they sort of build it out on a CDFA Healthy Soils separate piece of Comet Planner. And then what I will say is, I think the unique piece about the Healthy Soils program is the cost. We talked about a cap and all the great questions asked on that, but growers didn't have a way to put in their acreage and then see what the amount was and get a cap on a total dollar amount so that they can then translate that to the application. So that piece is really unique and new on the Healthy Soils piece. So we appreciate that there's a national program, but there's also opportunities to sort of carve out different pieces of that to be very specific to a state or a program.
Yes, that's
I would like to add to that as well that just from a scientific perspective, the Comet Planner tool is powered by a model known as DESCENT. And that's in the research and scientific community, that's a large scale model that can calculate your carbon and nitrogen inputs and how they associate with different farming systems. So those models certainly have the capacity to be applied to any system in the world and not just United States or not just California. The point that becomes important for Comet Planner is when you take any type of model, what kind of data are you putting into that model to get projections out of it? And that's kind of where what Dr. Gunasekar mentioned, the USDA model uses United States data or Midwestern data. For California Healthy Soils tool, we were able to get some California specific data. Those larger models are certainly out there. Actually, the California version of the Comet Planner uses two models. One is called DESCENT and the other is called the denitrification decomposition or the DNDC model. And absolutely available, the Canadian data sets, there's opportunity to develop something similar there, because those models are, those are universally available scientific tools. And it's really about what kind of data you have available to feed into that model, and it can be, in theory, it can be built.
Yeah, one thing I would also like to add that Dr. Joshi just reminded me, Chaland, is, one thing we try to strive for with this. So the Comet Planner tool addresses a legislative requirement that said any programs that use cap and trade revenue must have a quantification methodology. And this methodology should be developed by the California Yard Resources Board. So we worked with them very closely to build this. And one of the things we wanted to do was there are 3 tier levels of sort of scientific rigor established by the IPCC. This is sort of the governing international body on climate change. It's called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm sure you know about it. But, they have different tier levels. And so, the first tier level is, okay, you just have some basic information. And I'm really summarizing here, so don't quote me on this. But the second tier is like, okay, you have sort of this modeling piece. And then the third tier is, you have the best data you can in the world. You have done field studies, etc. And so we were trying to sort of make sure we have addressed that sort of second tier. And that's why the modeling piece is so important. And we have the modeling, and then we mimic the program to sort of represent the modeling or make sure that the program requirements stand up the modeling that takes place, which is why we have those 3-year requirements at a minimum, that you have to do it for 3 years. Thank you.
For that. I think that's incredibly helpful and very encouraging. I'm very keen to dive into that a little bit deeper after our meeting. I notice when you go through it, it provides you with a menu or a suite of choices to select from, but I'm just curious if there is somewhere built within that tool that gives the actionable steps that are associated with those instead of just sort of headers. Is there somewhere where farmers can get more in-depth information on what taking on those practices actually looks like in action?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And so with that, we would also like to highlight that, the Comet Planner tool and a lot of the practices that are part of the CDFA's Healthy Soils program, we are working in close partnership with our federal counterparts, the USDA. And they have an agency called the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS. That service has had a program called EQIP, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, that has been around for many decades. And many of the practices that are part of Healthy Soils are also part of the NRCS EQIP. The difference is that the NRCS program is not driven by the greenhouse gas piece of it. So it's more designed to be a broader, environmentally beneficial conservation of natural resources type of program. But the great thing is that each one of the practices, except for 2 practices that are unique to the CDFA Healthy Soils program, are shared with the USDA program. And as you can see on this slide, each practice header, it comes with this number, CPS 393 or CPS 512. So that CPS is a conservation practice standard. And that's actually a document that has been developed by the USDA. It's usually a 3 to 4 page document, which is essentially the recipe for what that practice is. So for example, here, the CPS 393 on filter strip, that document would explain what the purpose of that practice is, what it means, what type of land area and agricultural lands and farms can it be implemented on, and what are some requirements that must be met when that practice is being implemented. In some cases, that could be what the density of saplings that need to be planted or density of plants that must be planted, 300 plants an acre, something like that. Specifically for filter strip or other practices, sometimes they also have to take into account the slope because they're close to a water drain or ditch. So those types of sort of instructions and recipes on how to implement the practices are available in the USDA documentation for each one. For the 2 practices that are California specific, we do have our CDFA specific reports that support those practices that have similar information. So this slide here shows links, those white papers on compost application and whole orchard recycling. Those are, they contain requirements for how those practices should be implemented. So one example is that application rate that Dr. Gunasekara mentioned, how much compost to be applied on land so that it doesn't create other problems, for example, for water quality and such. So those types of instructions and numbers and information are available in those white paper documents as well.
That exactly answers what I was wondering. That was the piece I wasn't seeing with this great tool, was the menu of action items, if you will, the recipe that went along with it. So that's really useful. That's quite comprehensive. I'm really interested in this as a model by which we could develop some pretty good practices. I'm quite interested in understanding what this experience is like from the perspective of a farmer. So I understand that a farmer would be interested in enrolling in this program. Perhaps they have visited a demonstration site and had the opportunity to see someone who is growing a comparable crop to them. They've heard their real life experience and they decide they would like to participate. So they would go to the website, they would select through the menu of options to find the practices that they think would be a particularly good fit for their farm. They enter them in, it sums it up for them. They are required to send yearly soil samples. What other actions must I take as a farmer in this situation?
Yeah, so of course, applying for the grant itself is one of those actions. And, so one would go to our CDFA Healthy Soils website and see if we are open for accepting grants. And if we are, then there is an online application to which they can attach these Comet Planner report. And maybe we can show that replan tool as well, Ami, if we are able to share screen. That might be interesting. So soil samples, and then the third piece goes back to that verification piece that we were talking earlier, where they have to consent that someone from CDFA can come out to their field to verify that the practice is being implemented. Or we could do, those geotag photos or collection of some photos and videos from their farm in order to verify that those practices have been implemented. It's a 3-year commitment. So that is essentially what they would be expecting. Another thing that we should add here is that we talked a little bit about technical assistance. And, when we first started the technical assistance piece, it was primarily geared towards helping farmers prepare their applications and submitting them, which helps them go through that process of, okay, which practice makes sense for my farm, and selecting them. Now there have been, some modifications to our technical assistance program since last year. It has evolved, and the technical assistance providers are not only available to help with submission of the application, but also provide one-on-one assistance throughout that 3-year period to the farmer. And when they're actually actively implementing the practice, if they need technical assistance, if they need help with certain equipment, or just making sure that they're doing the practice correctly, that they've planned it well, they can get that help from the technical assistance providers as well. So it's much more comprehensive now. So, it's still hard for them to do it on their own, even though Comet Planner does make it look very easy.
Quite streamlined, and I'm always aware that what it looks like on our end and what it's like for the farmers can be vastly different. So I was curious if there is any additional feedback that you have received from farmers on areas that are bumpy or things we should be aware of if we were to implement something similar, on how to make sure it is most easily accessible and not an unnecessary amount of paperwork, if you will, for farmers.
Yeah, Chaland, I think that was always our goal, to make this easy as possible to apply for. Then they set up a contract, they go ahead and they implement it, and then we have a couple of verification components and a soil sampling component. That was it. So I think the big lesson that we can take away from this is, when we first started out with this program, it wasn't that user-friendly because it had a lot of these moving pieces, and some of the moving pieces is, hey, you can apply this practice, but by the way, you can't apply this practice because you're double counting your greenhouse gases. So fitting the program in with the greenhouse gas requirements and the funding source, and then also having growers come into it and being really user-friendly was a challenge at first. But I think we have developed some really user-friendly tools and a great application platform that's now very easy to fill out. We have got mostly positive responses from growers on all of our pieces of how to put this all together, an application to contracts to a verification. We have got mostly positive responses. I think one of the things that we always struggle with is that I think is a really important lesson is the timeline of the funding. We have 4 years total to liquidate the funds. That means we have to award the projects in the first year, and they have 3 years then after that to liquidate the funds. And we get into a situation where if the grower misses the first planting or the first year's planting, then they can't move forward with the project because we don't have any flexibility on the funding timelines in the back end. So I think the big thing for us is the more flexibility on the time we can allow for them to implement these projects would be good. And we encourage folks to have that sort of instead of a 4-year or a 3-year, instead of a 4-year liquidation with a 3-year implementation period, can you have a longer flexible program on the timelines? So those are some of the lessons we learned. We would certainly be happy to put together a quick list of things to look out for that we can share with your team as we go through this. And I think another thing is really hearing from the growers themselves through a public comment process. We have allowed to hear from growers and stakeholders through the Environmental Farming Act. And trust me, they're constantly giving us comments on how to still improve the program. So we are very open to that, and we can certainly share that with your teams further.
Speaking for myself, I can certainly say I would be interested in receiving a list of lessons learned, if you will, on areas that you think would be useful for us to be aware of. I think the point you just made is particularly relevant for legislators to hear on the importance of this being a longer-term availability of funding, particularly, as you had said, in the first year and a half, there was less uptake. It took some time for more farmers to have the opportunity to attend these demonstration projects and really see from other farmers, instead of from scientists or politicians, why this is worthy of taking on. So I think that's a really important point that you've made. I also think the decision to sort of have two streams in which you've approached this, one with incentives for farmers and one stream as demonstration farms, is very wise in that regard, because it does give an opportunity for that sort of engagement. I know that we have a new school, UPEI is doing a new division on climate change that is interested in experiential learning, as I see it. So I see this as a potential great opportunity for pairings with demonstration projects. And I'm curious if you are also doing any sort of studying on the qualitative benefits. I can imagine it's very easy to quantify things like carbon stored, but things that farmers are hearing from their anecdotal experience, increased biodiversity, better water retention, increasing crop yields, all of those soft benefits that can be more qualitative than quantitative, that account for why a $40 per ton carbon abatement cost is useful, those dynamic benefits that aren't just the static costs. I'm wondering if anyone is studying those qualitative components.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Land, for that question. Great question. Yes, we are very focused on ecosystem services, and that's how we define these qualitative benefits that come out of our programs. We have certainly struggled to put a value with those, and we have even tried to look and see if there's an economic value, a general economic value that could have put in to, for example, if you plant a riparian buffer as part of the Healthy Soils program, what are the pollinator benefits? What are the reduced sediment erosion benefits that come out of there? And that's been a challenging point. But we do have a very robust list of ecosystem services that we have developed. We'll be happy to share that with your team as well, and provide some literature on that. But we haven't necessarily tied it directly to the Healthy Soils program. And so we're working now with the California Yarrow Resources Board, to try to look at some core benefits that we can attribute to that piece. Geethika, do you want to add more on that piece?
Sure. Yeah. Over the years, for instance, now we do have the ability, it's called the co-benefit calculator tool, which we'll be happy to share link with you with the California Air Resources Board. For example, the particulate emissions, PM 2.5, and NOx, which is nitrogen oxides, which are associated also with air quality. Those type of parameters. Earlier, we used to talk about air quality in purely qualitative terms, but now we do have the ability to come up with a similar model estimated projection for some of those types of emissions and benefits associated with specific practices. So it's a continually evolving space. We should also add that the demonstration projects that are funded through the Healthy Soils Grant, especially those type A projects where university researchers are involved, often they look more like comprehensive research projects than just a demonstration project. And the mandatory requirement is for them to measure greenhouse gases, but many of those projects are trying to measure these other types of co-benefits, whether it is soil properties, or other types of environmental impacts as well. So over time, we hope to have a good collection of research studies and their findings that are published and available that could be associated to the Healthy Soils program as well.
That's very interesting to me. I am quite intrigued about the idea of trying to put valuation to ecosystem services. I've seen examples in other jurisdictions that do a natural asset valuation that sort of take account for the co-benefits, as you're calling them, that are received from our natural assets or natural infrastructure, if you will. So I'm really interested in receiving information on that tool, if that's at all possible. I do have just one other final question for you, and it's a little bit off the side, but I'm curious, given how much research your departments have done on this, have you had the opportunity to examine what sort of impacts nitrogen fertilizer or chemical fertilizers have to soil organic carbon or soil organic matter? I've seen some studies recently that suggest using these can actually cause a depletion of soil organic carbon. And I'm just wondering if that's something you can speak to me at all about.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, I will try to share some thoughts, and hopefully Dr. Gunasekar can add more. The nitrogen piece is really intriguing from a couple of different points of view. One is that nitrogen by itself, especially when added as a synthetic input and combined with irrigation, and irrigation can sometimes create waterlogged conditions in the soil, it can generate a gas, nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas. And it's a few hundred times more potent than carbon dioxide. So in some cases, an excessive use of nitrogen fertilizer, even if there were other carbon sequestration practices being done, just the nitrous oxide emissions alone could sort of overtake the greenhouse gas benefits from the carbon sequestration. So recognizing that, one of the practices that is incentivized through our program is a reduction in synthetic nitrogen application by 15%. And we're able to quantify and include that in the Comet Planner tool and incentivize it. So that's a very direct connection. And then of course, as how you're talking about that, nitrogen, if we think about the soil microbes and the roots that live in the soil, the plant roots, nitrogen is part of the food source. Just like we eat proteins, the nitrogen fertilizer is that nitrogen source for those living organisms. So if there is a lot of nitrogen, it can kickstart a lot of biological activity that, especially in the short term, means that the organisms are eating a lot more and they're metabolizing everything faster, which means that some of the stored carbon can become part of the food that they start metabolizing. So it is certainly a very delicate balance of carbon and nitrogen, and how to kind of balance it in such a way that we could get a net carbon sequestration rather than an increased carbon metabolism. And the great thing is those models, DASEND and DNDC that we were mentioning earlier, they do have the ability to calculate these biological processes, so that when we calculate for specific practices and specific farming systems to develop that Comet Planner tool, when we see a net carbon sequestration, it does assume certain levels of nitrogen inputs that could still give us a net carbon reduction. So it's definitely, there's definitely a scientific and data-based component to get us to that input. But I wanted to share some of those, just the conceptual idea behind it. And Dr. Gunasekar, if you would like to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Joshi, and thank you, Dr. Lund, for the question. And I'll let Rachel, I'll add some comments and then ask Rachel to sort of provide a broader overview on the nitrate issue, which is a significant topic. But what I'll say is so when we were looking at the compost application rates, we were very thoughtful about nitrate release or nitrogen release from that compost. And so we worked very closely with the sister agencies to come up with that rate, which is, ranges from, for example, 6 to 8 tons for cropland. And we set that application rate being thoughtful that, if you add a lot more, that there might be hindrances or release of the nitrogen to water bodies. So we went through an exercise where we brought some experts together and calculated what the release of that nitrogen from the compost would be, and then we backed into the application rate. So we have thought about this in terms of the Healthy Soils Program, but I will say that we work on the topic of nitrogen in partnership with some other CDFA entities. For example, we have the CDFA Fertilizer Research and Education Program, and they get a mill assessment from fertilizer sales to do research to look and see what to develop new tools on nitrogen management for growers, but then also look at the research around having greater efficiency from the crop to take up nitrogen so that the nitrogen isn't leaching to the groundwater system and to your surface water bodies. So one really nice tool that has come out of that program is, and we will happy to send you additional information on this too, is that we developed a tool to show growers when the demand of the crop is a very specific crop, let's say almonds, when the demand for almonds is during the growing seasons, that growers can be informed on when to apply their nitrogen at the right time, at the right rate. And this is a really great tool because we couldn't address all the crops, but we have sort of the top 25 crops that address 80 to 90% of the irrigated land in this state. And so we work in, we hope that the Healthy Soils Program is complementary to these other existing programs that then show, and highlight to growers that these other resources are also important when applying nitrogen.
Yeah, just to add on to that, you made a great point that I was going to make about our fertilizer research program. This is a program that we actually just got some funding for in the last budget cycle. We did put out a grant of $1.5 million earlier this year. I believe it was in January. They were awarded to agricultural organizations and universities to do research to improve the efficiency of nitrogen fertilization in California agriculture, reduce the associated environmental impacts and advance farmers' understandings and implementation of best practices for fertilizer application in farmland. So these best practices are going to be a partnership between CDFA, but as well as our sister agencies under the California Environmental Protection Agency. And California continues to explore, the opportunities that we have with science that's improving on this side.
Presentation today. I'm just looking to my committee members to see if anyone else has any additional questions. And with that, I thank you so much for giving us your time today and taking the time to share this information. I think it's incredible that we are now in a time where we can hear from examples clear across the country and indeed in other countries on what their experiences have been. So thank you so much for this presentation today. I'm just going to very quickly adjourn while we reset, and then we will finish the rest of our meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we are back with the Special Committee on Climate Change. Now, our next agenda item will be reviewing of schedule and work plan. Clerk, I wonder if you might be willing to advise us on our next scheduled meetings?
The next meeting is next Thursday, October 29th at 1:30 p.m. We'll have the PEI Climate Change Secretary provide a progress update on the work done under the PEI Climate Change Action Plan and also address carbon abatement information gathering as well. Also at that meeting, we have a second presentation that'll be by Reg Phelan, and he'll be talking about agriculture and climate change. Then following that, the next meeting is November 5th at 1:30, and it'll be the Department of Transportation, Infrastructure and Energy talking about the Sustainable Transportation Action Plan and Sustainable Communities Initiative.
Fantastic, and I would suggest with the legislature opening the next week that we pause committee meetings until after the House rises, if there's no objections to that. Unless, of course, we're ready to talk about our report. But without carbon abatement costs, I don't see that happening. So, next agenda item is new business. I do have an email from Sydney. He has requested that we follow up with our presenters and ask for the carbon abatement costs associated with each of the practices in their HSP program. Can I have a motion to support that? Yeah, fantastic. Any objection to us following up on this one? I think it would be really useful. I will take that as support. Any other new business items that anyone would like to raise? You good? Fantastic. And with that, can I get a motion for adjournment? Moved by Brad. Thank you very much, committee members.